Another day, another sleeper. Why sleepers? Well, last week, if you saw, I built this stool from that oak sleeper, and this week I've got this big chunky monkey. Now, it's a softwood sleeper this time, and it's in a pretty bad state, but what I'm going to try and do is make a little side table, but I'll bring you in closer and we'll examine the sleeper and you'll see why it could be problematic. That is almost certainly going to fly off, this big bit here, and you turn it over, you'll see we've got all this, so a lot of this isn't going to be usable all the way down to say 400 mil. There's bits coming off like that. So the plan is mill it up as best I can, then I will know which of the two designs that are currently only residing in my head to go with. But I would say with sleepers, you get a lot of wood for your money if you're prepared to put in the work. And the oak stool last week I was so chuffed with. This week, a side table from this, I'm not so sure. So I checked that it's got a flat, non-wobbling bottom and success. So I grabbed my square and I'm also relieved to find out that it's got a square edge. So I'll break out the old thicknesser and reference that non-wobbling flat side with the top side going through and getting a couple of parallel edges. It come out looking like shop bought pine. I don't know what I was expecting. I thought maybe this could be like very old and have a bit of character, but not to be. So then it was time to knock the edges off. So I referenced the square edge against the fence and run it through 3 times, taking off 30 mil each time. Manhandling something this large is a good reason to get some kind of in-feed table, but my whole workshop's barely 12 foot long, so that's not going to happen. And because the blade only goes 90 mil and this was just over, I just have to flip it over and nip the little bit off the other side. Then I could get that square edge up against the fence and take off the other side. Now, making furniture from something like this, I don't know whether people still want it to look like it's an old rustic piece of furniture, because it did strike me when I was doing this, I'm basically just milling it within an inch of its life, and it could have been, bar the odd little blemish, it could be wood bought off the shelf. And I don't know whether people want something rustic looking, or they're happy to know it came from a reclaimed source but without reclaimed characteristics. So I've got 5 30mm planks, and I put 3 of them through the thicknesser. No, I put them all through the thicknesser, but 3 of them I wanted the same thickness. I'll break out the hand plane to get a nice flat edge ready for gluing up. But before that, I'll cut them to length to save on glue. And have a relatively easy glue up. I do go to put a cull on at one point, but there's only 2 glue joints and it behaved pretty well, so I just left it as it was and wiped away the excess glue. and that was put to one side, and it was time to concentrate on the legs. Now there'd be 2 legs on this item of furniture, not 4, and it'll become clear shortly why that is. And I had these pieces to choose from, but I wanted to rip them down to a more appropriate width, and also I wanted to see how deep the crack went in one of the pieces, and as it turns out it was too deep, so I end up getting both 550mm legs from the one length. Now the design of this is a top, a bottom and 2 angled legs essentially. Now to work out that angle, I end up drawing to scale the top and the bottom on my bench, and then that way I can just hold the wood up to my drawing and I can get the angle without trying to work out any fancy mathematics. Then I can lock that angle off with the sliding bevel and transfer that angle across to the mitre saw. The design didn't leave much room for any tolerance either, so I wanted both legs to be absolutely bang on in terms of length. So I clamp them together and ensure that I get them both identical. Then I transferred the same angle and slid the mitre saw over to that angle to put trenching cuts on the top of the legs, but the bolt that holds the depth slipped, so I went a little bit deeper than I needed to, but it didn't work out too bad. But I need to investigate that because it could have been disastrous. So fresh out the clamps, it was time to address the tabletop and the bottom. So I'll get rid of some of the glue with the chisel and then just belt and braces through the thicknesser again. I think the final thickness was around about 27mm. Then I could square up one end. Before cutting the top or the bottom, I didn't know at this point. And then, as I did with the legs, I clamped them together just to make sure they're both the same. And they were 28cm square. So here you can see a sneak peek into the future. That's what it's going to look like. Now to seat the top into that trenching cut, I would need to put the same angle, that angle there, onto the back of the tabletop. So I did this by transferring it across to the table saw and running the tabletop through, and that would ensure that that angle would then seat well in the trenching cut I just made. There you go. And I also put the same angle on the bottom, but this would just be for show. Then I put a heavy chamfer on all the legs and the tops. But my chamfering bit's quite cheap, and at one point coming up, the ball bearing that it rides along just fell off, and I had to scrabble on the floor looking for the tiniest nut and little bolt. There you go. Whoops, where's that gone? But I find it and I have to screw it back in. But I'm going to upgrade these bits because they're not very good. And the chamfering was so poor, I really had to go to town with 60 grit sandpaper on every chamfer, really trying to maintain that crispness and not round it over. Had a little bit of a repair to do as well, just making that crack good and tidying up that knot with a little bit of super glue. Then it was back to sanding up to 180. As you can see, the chamfer looks a right mess. New bits needed. Now, nothing fancy with attaching the legs to the base. It was literally drill a straight hole up from the bottom and 2 screws per leg up. But what I did do was put the screw in from the base and protrude it slightly, so I could have the leg, because it was at an angle, it was a bit tricky. So with the 2 screws protruding up here, you can't see them but they are, I could then force the leg onto the screws with the glue on, knowing that it wouldn't shift around whilst I drove home the screws fully, and it worked. And before putting the top on, I just wanted to make sure that obviously these would be parallel. If I could describe this furniture, I'd say it's very geometric. Everything's angles and chamfers, and the parallel, the gap between the 2 legs was important. I didn't want it to look off. So I get the digital gauge. Unfortunately mine's only cheap, it doesn't lock off, but I managed to get them the same. So it's 2 parallel legs before putting the top on. Now with the top, same as the bottom really, I drilled in from the top, put a lot of glue on and then plugged it. I did think about hiding the dowels within as dowel joinery, but because the legs were angled, and my experience of dowels, it's hard enough getting them to line up when it's 2 flat surfaces. So when you're dealing with angled legs, I thought I got no chance. I'm going to drill in from the top and plug them. I don't mind how plugs look. Some people might. But I was trying to get this made in a day. I think the whole build took about 6 hours, because I've got to make sure that it's cost effective to make such an item when I'm selling it, and if I'm getting into putting 3 hours on it, it's not going to be worth my time for the sake of different types of joinery that, to my mind, for this piece wouldn't make a difference. That's not to say that would be the approach on every item, but for this one it was a good solid fix, and you know, it's about function as well as form. So I clamp the front to the back to make sure it squeezes into that recess whilst I'm driving the screws home, before piling in a lot of glue and hammering home for dowels. And because of all the angularity of the piece and the chamfers and so on, I didn't want to leave those squared off at the top, so I'm very carefully putting the tiny chamfer on the top of these legs. It's only very slight, but I think it just makes a difference than having it squared off. And I'll just go over it quickly with some sandpaper, and then I'll do the same on the back. I would have used my block plane, but because of how the legs jut out, it would have been a bit awkward. I'll just go along with the chisel. Then I can flush cut the dowels and sand them flush with the top. Then it was time for some Osmo as a finish. It's becoming my new favourite finish. A normal oil finish would have made this so yellow and banana like, and I didn't want to do that, whereas Osmo doesn't tend to send it as crazy yellow as some oil finishes. And I like the application. You put it on with these white non-abrasive pads, rubbing it into the grain, and then just go over it with a separate one that's clean along the grain, and I end up giving it 3 coats. And here it is. What do you guys think? Now, I'll put a picture of the sleeper it came from on screen, and there we go, making some nice furniture from an old sleeper. Overall, happy with that one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week. Bye.